The biker kicked the boy's crutch to the ground, and the crowd held its breath. But just when the boy thought he was alone, a black car pulled up to the curb, and when the door opened, Sylvester Stallone stepped out. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The small town of Pine Ridge was settling into its usual calm on a crisp evening. The streets, lit by warm street lamps, seemed to glow with an almost nostalgic charm, the air carrying the faint smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the block. There was something comforting about the quiet hum of a community winding down after a long day, the sound of distant voices and laughter drifting out from the corner diner. Among the small clusters of people walking, there was a boy named Tommy, who always seemed to move at his own pace. His crutch tapped rhythmically against the pavement as he made his way down Main Street. Tommy was used to people glancing at him out of the corners of their eyes, some offering pity, others curiosity. But he was used to it. The pain in his leg was something he had carried for years, but it didn't define him. He had dreams of more, of adventure, of strength, of the freedom the world seemed to offer everyone but him. He paused for a moment at the fountain in the square, watching the water sparkle under the streetlights. A peaceful moment, a rare one where his thoughts weren't interrupted by the world's expectations or his own limitations. It was during this brief respite that he heard the unmistakable rumble of a motorcycle's engine. The sound grew louder, echoing down the street like a storm approaching. Tommy looked up, squinting against the headlights of a bike tearing down the street, the rider's silhouette looming like a shadow. The biker was fast, reckless, as though the world was his personal racetrack. The bike screeched to a halt near the fountain, the engine sputtering out, and a man in a leather jacket dismounted with a grin. He looked at Tommy with a sneer, as though the boy were some sort of obstacle in his path. Tommy didn't flinch, but his heart picked up pace, sensing something was about to break the quiet of the evening. The biker sauntered closer, his boots thudding heavily against the ground. Tommy's grip tightened on his crutch, but he stayed rooted. The night was still, but the tension was rising slowly, like the prelude to a storm. The biker eyed Tommy with amusement, his grin widening as he approached. The air around them seemed to crackle with a mix of intimidation and challenge. The boy was alone, vulnerable, an easy target for someone looking to make a statement. The biker's leather jacket creaked as he adjusted it, his fingers brushing against the chrome chain hanging from his belt. "What's the matter, kid?" the biker sneered, his voice rough like gravel. "You lost? Or we're just out here playing pretend?" Tommy stood tall, resisting the urge to shrink back. He could feel the sting of the biker's words, but he refused to let them pierce him. The crutch in his hand wasn't just a tool for support. It was a symbol of his resilience. "I'm not lost," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "Just out for a walk." The biker chuckled, the sound mocking. "A walk? With a crutch." He took a step closer, his boots thudding on the ground, causing Tommy's pulse to quicken. "You really think you belong here, boy? People like you don't get to walk around like nothing's wrong." Tommy clenched his jaw, his hand tightening on his crutch. He knew he was different, that he didn't always fit in, but he wasn't going to let anyone talk down to him like this. Without warning, the biker kicked Tommy's crutch, sending it flying out of his hands. It landed on the pavement with a sharp clatter. Tommy's heart raced as he stumbled, his legs buckling slightly under the sudden loss of support. The crowd, which had gathered on the edges of the street, watched in stunned silence. Some were unsure whether to intervene. Others were too shocked by the audacity of the biker's actions. Tommy looked up, eyes narrowing. He could feel his muscles tense, a simmering fury rising within him, but he didn't move. Instead, he straightened up, his gaze locking with the biker's. "I don't need your help," Tommy said quietly, but the words carried. "But you're going to regret this." The biker smirked, stepping back, clearly expecting Tommy to back down. Instead, Tommy stood his ground, ready to face whatever came next. The biker's smile twisted into something darker as he watched Tommy regain his balance, his crutch now lying useless on the ground. He took a slow step forward, deliberately closing the space between them. His boots echoed on the pavement, each step making the tension thicker. "What's the matter, cripple?" the biker taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You want me to help you up? You want some sympathy? You won't get any from me." The words hit Tommy like a slap. His throat tightened, but he held firm, not letting the biker see the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He wasn't about to give the man the satisfaction of seeing him break. Without warning, the biker lunged forward, his hand grasping the handle of Tommy's crutch. He yanked it away, holding it high above Tommy's head, mocking him. "Look at you," he sneered. "What kind of man lets himself get dragged around like this?" Tommy's heart hammered in his chest, but he refused to let it show. He had been through worse, had endured cruelty before. This was just another test. His gaze was locked on the biker, every muscle in his body ready to react, but he held back. The biker tossed the crutch aside with a careless flick, the sound of it clattering on the concrete like a final insult. "You're not even worth the fight," he spat, his voice low and full of contempt. Tommy clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably, some even muttering under their breath. It was clear they were witnessing something ugly, but no one seemed willing to step in. The biker took a step back, standing tall, watching Tommy carefully. "I thought you'd be tougher," he said, his voice a mockery of curiosity. "Guess you're just another weakling after all." Tommy stood in the middle of the street, humiliated but not broken. He didn't need anyone's sympathy. He didn't need the biker's approval. What he needed was to hold his ground, no matter how cruel the world tried to be. The biker's laughter echoed around the street, a cruel, grating sound that made Tommy's skin burn with shame. He didn't even flinch when the man turned away, as though Tommy was nothing more than an annoyance. But then, in the blink of an eye, the biker kicked out, his boot connecting with Tommy's leg. The impact was sharp, sudden, and Tommy's knee buckled. His body twisted sideways as the world spun around him. He tried to catch himself, reaching out with his arms, but his crutch had been discarded too far away. His balance was gone, and he hit the ground hard, the asphalt scraping against his palms and cheek. A gasp rose from the small crowd that had gathered, some of them wincing at the brutal blow, others uncertain whether they should intervene. Tommy's body trembled slightly from the force of the fall. His face was flushed with humiliation, but it was the burning ache in his leg that hurt the most. The one thing he had relied on for years, his strength in spite of the pain, had just been shattered in an instant. The biker stood over him, looking down with a smirk that bordered on disgust. "What's wrong, boy?" he taunted, the words venomous. "You can't even take a hit." He took a step back, as if ready to leave, but the look in Tommy's eyes stopped him. Tommy didn't move immediately. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his muscles burning with the effort of holding himself still. He could feel the weight of the biker's stare on him, the cruel satisfaction in the air. Slowly, Tommy pushed himself up, hands scraping against the rough pavement for leverage. His legs screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to let the pain show. The crowd watched in silence as he stood, his body trembling with every movement. His leg felt like it was on fire, but he wasn't about to let this man see how much he had hurt him. He would rise, not for the crowd, not for the biker, but for himself. And in that moment, as he steadied himself, the anger inside him grew stronger than the pain. Tommy's mind raced as he limped down the alley, the distant hum of the street fading behind him. His leg burned, every step a reminder of the biker's cruelty, but it was the rage that boiled inside him that truly hurt. His hand gripped the side of the brick wall, his fingers digging into the rough surface as though it could anchor him to something solid, something real. The anger was raw, almost primal, as if the world had been telling him he wasn't enough, that he would never be enough. The biker's words echoed in his mind. Weakling, cripple, nothing. He couldn't let that be his story. Not again. Not anymore. Tommy's pulse thudded in his ears as the adrenaline surged. His chest heaved with each breath, and for a moment, he let himself feel it, the full weight of the humiliation, the pain, and the fury all wrapped up in one sharp, searing emotion. It wasn't just about the biker anymore. It was about every person who had ever looked at him with pity, who had underestimated him, who had written him off before he even had the chance to speak. He turned a corner, stumbling into a darker stretch of the alley, the shadows swallowing him up. His breath was shallow, his vision blurring at the edges as the pressure built up behind his eyes. He slammed his fist into the brick wall, the pain of the impact numbing for only a second before the raw emotion surged again. His knuckles scraped the brick, but it didn't matter. He couldn't focus on the pain of his body. It was the ache of his soul that consumed him. "Not like this," he muttered through clenched teeth. "I won't be this guy." A voice inside him pushed through the chaos, calm and clear. He had been knocked down before, in more ways than one. But this wasn't the end. Not this time. He wasn't going to be defined by a moment of cruelty. Tommy lifted his head, feeling the anger transform into something else. Determination, something stronger than anything that had tried to break him. He wasn't finished. Not yet. The alley was dark and silent, save for the soft rustling of trash and the distant hum of traffic. Tommy's breath slowed, his clenched fists loosening as the fury inside him began to settle, replaced by something quieter, something that felt almost hopeless. His crutch, now abandoned on the pavement back in the street, seemed like a distant memory. Everything seemed so distant. He hadn't even realized someone was approaching until the sound of footsteps grew closer, the steady rhythm sharp against the quiet backdrop of the alley. Tommy froze, eyes scanning the shadows, uncertain of who might be lurking in the dark. The figure stepped into the dim light, the unmistakable silhouette of a man, broad-shouldered and calm in his stride. Tommy's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the face, a face that had only appeared in the movies, only in the kind of scenes where villains were put in their place, where the good guys never faltered. Sylvester Stallone. It was impossible. The man before him looked like he had just stepped out of film, the kind of actor whose presence commanded the room, who brought a silent strength with every move he made. Tommy blinked, his mind racing, wondering if his anger had caused him to hallucinate. "You all right, kid?" Stallone's voice broke through the fog of confusion in Tommy's head, low and steady. There was no judgment, no mockery in his tone. It was simply concern. Tommy couldn't speak for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He felt like a child, exposed and vulnerable, as if everything he'd tried to hide, the pain, the hurt, the shame, was suddenly there, laid bare in front of the man standing before him. Stallone took a step closer, his gaze meeting Tommy's with understanding. "You don't have to take that," he said, a hint of steel in his voice, but also something softer. "You're stronger than that." For the first time in what felt like forever, Tommy felt a flicker of hope. His chest tightened, but this time it wasn't with anger. It was with something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling of not being alone. Stallone stood there for a moment, his presence steady and unshakable, like a mountain in the middle of the storm. Tommy still couldn't fully process what was happening. The anger that had been flooding his veins moments ago was now replaced with a mixture of disbelief and something he couldn't quite name. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows that stretched along the alley, and for a second, Tommy thought maybe he had imagined it all. But the man standing before him wasn't a figment of his imagination. This was real. Stallone, the actor who had shaped so many stories of perseverance and strength on screen, was now standing in front of him, real, alive, and somehow offering him something more than just a movie persona. "Hey, kid," Stallone spoke again, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the air like a knife. "I saw what happened back there. I'm not gonna lie, that was a dirty move by that guy. But you don't need to let him win." Tommy swallowed hard, still trying to make sense of everything. He had expected anger, maybe a hand up, but not this. Not someone who seemed genuinely concerned. I didn't know what to do," Tommy admitted, his voice raw, vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. He kicked my crutch. I felt like I couldn't stand up anymore." Stallone took a step closer, closing the distance between them. He didn't have the air of a celebrity here. No entourage, no flashing lights. Just a man who had seen more than his fair share of battles, both on screen and off. He crouched down to Tommy's level, meeting his gaze directly. "You've been knocked down before, haven't you?" Stallone asked, his eyes sharp but understanding. Tommy nodded slowly, unsure where this conversation was going. But he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Then you get back up. You don't let a moment define you, Stallone said, his voice low and steady. You fight back. That's how you win. The words sank in deep, and for the first time in hours, Tommy felt the weight on his chest lighten. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as helpless as he had felt. Tommy took a deep breath, trying to steady his pulse. The sound of his own heartbeat was the only thing that filled his ears. It was strange, being here with Stallone, someone he had only ever seen in action-packed scenes, fighting against impossible odds. Now, the man stood in front of him, offering nothing more than quiet strength. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Tommy's mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, questions, and emotions, but none of them seemed to form into something coherent. He just stared at the man, the one who had done so much for so many on screen, and now, for some inexplicable reason, seemed to be offering him guidance in the real world. I don't know what to say, Tommy muttered, his voice catching on the words. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of the moment or the shift inside him that made it so difficult to speak. All he had known was that everything he had ever been through, all the struggles, the setbacks, and the loneliness had led him to this point. Yet, in front of Stallone, it all felt small. Ridiculous, even. Stallone gave him a small smile, a quiet understanding in his eyes. You don't need to say anything, kid. Sometimes, just being here is enough. Tommy shook his head. No, I've been quiet for too long. I'll let people walk all over me. He gestured vaguely toward the street, the echoes of the biker's insults still lingering in the air. But I don't want to keep pretending like I'm fine when I'm not. Stallone nodded, his expression serious now. You gotta face it, kid. Face your fears. Face your demons. It's the only way to take your power back. Tommy's chest tightened. For the first time, he felt like someone truly saw him. Not just the boy with the crutch, not the one who got pushed around, but a person with strength, with the potential to stand up for himself. For the first time, Tommy felt like he was allowed to speak. And for the first time, he actually believed he could. The streets of Pine Ridge were quieter now, the usual evening bustle replaced by the soft hum of traffic in the distance. Tommy felt the weight of the crutch in his hand as he stood at the edge of the crosswalk, his eyes locked on the street ahead. Stallone had walked with him for a while, silent but supportive, like a steady presence in a storm. Tommy was still processing everything, the words, the moment. But as they approached the crosswalk, he saw him. The biker. The same man who had humiliated him earlier, standing near his motorcycle, watching the street as if he owned it. His eyes caught Tommy's, and that cocky grin spread across his face once again. Tommy's heart skipped, his grip tightening on his crutch. The anger he thought he had buried came surging back, raw and hot. The biker strolled forward, hands in his jacket pockets, his smirk never fading. Well, look who it is, he sneered. The kid who couldn't even keep his balance. Thought you'd walk away, huh? Thought I'd just let you go. Tommy stood his ground, his chest tight with a mixture of dread and resolve. He had been knocked down. He had been humiliated. But now, in this moment, he wasn't going to back down. He didn't need to. You've had your fun, Tommy said, his voice low but firm. Now it's my turn. Stallone, standing just behind Tommy, remained silent, his eyes never leaving the biker. It wasn't his fight. It was Tommy's, but there was a calm, steady energy about him that made the situation feel less like a confrontation and more like a pivotal moment. The biker's grin faltered just slightly. What? You think you can take me on? He laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. I'm not afraid of some kid with a crutch. Tommy didn't flinch. He took a step forward, moving past the biker and towards the street. It's not about being afraid, he said, his voice strong now. It's about respect. The biker hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his eyes. For the first time, Tommy could see it, a crack in the facade, a sign that the bully wasn't as untouchable as he had thought. And for the first time, Tommy felt the true weight of his own strength. The air between Tommy and the biker thickened, the tension palpable as they stood just feet apart, the streetlights casting long shadows over them. The biker's smirk remained, but it wasn't as confident as before. Tommy could feel the weight of his crutch in his hand, the familiar wooden grip grounding him, but this time, it wasn't about needing the crutch. It was about what he could stand for without it. The biker took a slow step forward, his boots clicking against the asphalt, but this time, there was hesitation in his stride. Tommy didn't flinch. He stood tall, eyes locked on the biker, his stance firm. For the first time, he wasn't the one backing down. The biker tried to regain control of the situation, his arrogance returning, but there was something different in the air now. The crowd that had gathered earlier was gone, leaving just the two of them, alone in the silent street. "You're making a mistake, kid," the biker said, his voice rough, a sneer still clinging to his words. "You really think you've got something to prove?" Tommy's jaw tightened, his breathing steady. He didn't need to prove anything. He had already done that, by standing here, by refusing to run. "No," he said calmly. "I'm just showing you what it means to be a man. It's not about taking someone down. It's about standing up when everyone expects you to stay down." The biker's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching as if he wanted to strike again. But he hesitated, the cocky demeanor slipping for the first time. Tommy felt it, a moment where the power shifted, where the biker wasn't the predator anymore. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The street was still, save for the sound of distant cars and the faint hum of the wind. Tommy could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind was clear. He wasn't going to let fear or anger guide him anymore. He was in control now. Finally, the biker stepped back, his shoulders stiff with frustration, as if he didn't know how to handle this quiet resistance. Tommy didn't lower his gaze. The fight wasn't over, but the first round was his. The biker's frustration grew palpable as he paced back and forth, like a caged animal unsure of how to break free. Tommy stood still, his body tense but unwavering. He could feel the intensity of the moment building, the silence between them a battlefield in itself. The biker's grip tightened around the handlebars of his motorcycle, knuckles white with anger. "Well, look at you," the biker sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you've got me all figured out? You think you've won just because you stood there like some little statue? You don't know what it means to be strong." Tommy didn't flinch. The taunt was meant to provoke him, to get under his skin. But it didn't. Tommy had been through too much to let words like these have any power over him now. The biker took a step forward, his boots thudding with each movement. "What? You're just going to stand there and take it? You think that's all it takes to be a man? You're nothing but a weak little boy who got lucky tonight." Tommy's eyes narrowed, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The biker was trying to bait him into a reaction. He wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, he met the biker's gaze directly, his eyes steady. "I've fought harder battles than you'll ever know," Tommy said, his voice calm and unwavering. "And I didn't fight them with arrogance or force. I fought with what was inside, with who I am. That's what makes a man strong." The biker laughed, but the sound was strained now, like a man trying to convince himself of something he didn't believe. "You're pathetic," he spat. "Still think you're tough? You're just a nobody." Tommy's heart didn't race. His breath didn't quicken. Instead, he stood firm, unmoved by the venomous words. He wasn't a nobody. He wasn't weak. And he wasn't backing down. "You'll find out," Tommy said quietly, his voice steady, "that you're wrong." The biker's taunts echoed in the street, but Tommy's resolve only grew stronger. He could feel the weight of the moment shifting with each passing second. The anger that had once burned so hot inside him was now replaced with something quieter, something more powerful, an inner strength that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. The biker's eyes flicked over Tommy, searching for a crack, a sign of weakness. But Tommy stood unmoving, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The crutch, now lying forgotten on the sidewalk, no longer felt like a symbol of his limitation. It felt like a tool, a part of him that helped him stay grounded. His legs might have been weak, but his will had never been stronger. "You don't get it, do you?" The biker sneered, stepping forward again. "You're nothing. You can barely stand on your own, and you think you're tough? What's that crutch going to do? You going to swing it at me?" Tommy didn't react. He didn't need to. He wasn't going to fight with words or weapons. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to be who he was, someone who had faced hardships and had never given up. That alone was his strength. The biker's eyes narrowed in frustration as he lunged forward, thinking he could intimidate Tommy into backing down. But Tommy's response was slow and deliberate, almost like time had slowed around them. As the biker closed the distance, Tommy shifted his weight and took a step back, using his crutch to pivot with precision. The biker's momentum worked against him. As he tried to swing a punch, Tommy sidestepped, tapping into a surprising agility he hadn't known he possessed. He grabbed the biker's wrist, twisting it with a swift movement that had the man stumbling off balance. In that instant, Tommy's body moved without hesitation, fluid and quick. Something inside him had clicked. The biker stumbled, barely catching himself, and for the first time, he looked unsure. Tommy stood there, breathing calmly, a quiet confidence radiating from him. This wasn't about brute force. It was about knowing who you were, and that made all the difference. The biker staggered back, trying to regain his footing, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and anger. Tommy didn't chase him. He stood there, still as a statue, watching the man, measuring every movement. The biker was used to overwhelming his opponents with sheer force, but Tommy wasn't the kind of person who would crumble under pressure. He was playing a different game, one where what's mattered more than strength. The biker wiped his mouth, his eyes narrowing with irritation. "What's the matter with you?" he growled, trying to find control again. "You're not even going to fight me like a man? You think you're smarter than me?" Tommy tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. He didn't need to answer. The fight wasn't about beating the biker physically. It was about making him realize that his arrogance wasn't enough. The biker was used to intimidation, but Tommy wasn't afraid. And that was the real battle, wasn't it? Who could outlast the other? Who could stay calm when the world seemed to be screaming for chaos? The biker took another step forward, his posture stiff, but Tommy could see the uncertainty creeping into his movements. The cocky bravado had faded, replaced by growing frustration. This was no longer just about showing off. It was about proving something to himself. "You're just a little punk," the biker spat, his voice rising. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know anything about real strength. I'll show you." But Tommy didn't take the bait. He was done with being the punching bag, done with letting people dictate how he should feel. He wasn't going to fight the way the biker wanted. He wasn't going to play into his hands. Instead, Tommy took a step back and offered the biker a calm, knowing look. "You want to prove something? Prove you're better than a bully. Prove you don't need to run your mouth to feel powerful." The words hit harder than any punch could. The biker froze, uncertainty flickering across his face. Tommy hadn't attacked, hadn't struck out. He had simply shown the man his own weakness, his inability to truly understand what strength was. And that, more than anything, was a blow the biker couldn't recover from. The street was eerily quiet now, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The biker, still standing just a few feet away, seemed to be struggling with something within himself. His chest heaved as he breathed heavily, his hands twitching at his sides, as if he were debating whether to charge or retreat. Tommy didn't move. His crutch was still discarded on the pavement, but it felt lighter in his hand now, almost irrelevant. This wasn't about needing something to lean on anymore. It was about what was inside him, what had always been inside him. Tommy had been pushed around his whole life, made to feel small because of his leg, because of his crutch. But not tonight. Not now. He wasn't going to let the biker or anyone define his strength. It wasn't about showing the world what he could do. It was about showing himself. "Come on, kid." The biker sneered again, trying to provoke him. "What are you waiting for? You going to stand there all night?" Tommy's resolve hardened. He stood tall, his head high, his eyes unwavering. "I'm not waiting for anything," he said quietly. "I've already done what I needed to do." The biker's smirk faltered, confusion flickering in his eyes. He had expected the kid to crumble, to be intimidated, but Tommy wasn't playing by the same rules. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means I'm done letting people think I'm weak," Tommy said, his voice steady, gaining strength with every word. "I don't need to prove anything to you. I don't need to fight with fists or words. I'm stronger than that. The biker's expression shifted, a moment of doubt crossing his face. Tommy could see it, the cracks in the facade, the realization that this wasn't the battle he had thought it was. Tommy took a step forward, his stance unshaken, his heart steady. I'm done being your punching bag. And if you think I'm not worth your time, then maybe that's the best thing you can say to me. The biker opened his mouth, but the words never came. Instead, he took a step back, the weight of Tommy's resolve settling in the space between them. Tommy didn't need to fight. His strength was already showing. The crowd, which had gathered in the distance, had been watching the exchange between Tommy and the biker with increasing intensity. At first, they had been unsure of what to expect, unsure if they should get involved or just stand back. But as the confrontation wore on, something changed. What had begun as a moment of tension had shifted, slowly but surely, into something more. The biker's bravado was starting to crumble, and Tommy was standing his ground, unwavering. Eyes from windows, doorways, and across the street remained fixed on the two of them, the crowd almost hypnotized by the quiet power of the standoff. The biker's every movement had been met with disdain from Tommy's calm demeanor. Tommy wasn't responding the way everyone thought he would. He wasn't running away. He wasn't getting angry. Instead, he was doing the one thing the biker hadn't counted on. He was staying still. Some in the crowd had once whispered about Tommy, about the boy with the crutch, the one who couldn't keep up, the one who had to fight harder than most. But tonight, those whispers had died down, replaced with something else. Respect. It wasn't the loud, boisterous kind. It wasn't the kind that came with applause or cheers. It was quiet, just like Tommy, respect that came from seeing something real. The biker shifted, his hand twitching at his side as if unsure of his next move. The crowd held its breath, waiting for him to lash out, to do something, anything. But nothing came. The words of the taunts had faded. The cocky attitude was slowly slipping away. And for the first time, the biker looked unsure. Tommy stayed rooted in place, his gaze never leaving the biker. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, his heart pounding in a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. He wasn't afraid of this man. He wasn't afraid of anything anymore. And as the crowd watched, they saw something shift in Tommy. It wasn't just about standing up for himself anymore. It was about showing them all that courage didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be forceful. It just needed to be real. The silence between Tommy and the biker lingered, stretching out longer than either of them anticipated. The street was still, save for the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional flutter of leaves in the wind. Tommy didn't break his gaze, his resolve unshaken, but the biker was shifting now, his body language tense. It was as if the fight had moved beyond fists and words into a deeper realm, one that neither of them had expected. "All right, kid," the biker finally muttered, breaking the silence with a reluctant sigh. "I get it. You think you've got this all figured out." Tommy's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he stayed quiet, waiting, wondering where this was going. He could feel something else in the air now, something beneath the surface of the biker's usual bravado. It was almost regret. The biker shifted on his feet, his eyes not quite meeting Tommy's. "You think you're the only one who's had it hard?" he asked, his voice quieter now, a touch of weariness creeping in. "You think you're the only one who's been knocked down and had to get back up?" Tommy hesitated, unsure what to make of the sudden shift in tone. The biker had been so loud, so brash, but now, something in his eyes seemed to reveal a deeper layer, something that wasn't about the power he thought he held, but something that spoke of his own struggles. "I didn't choose this life," the biker continued, almost to himself. "I didn't want to be this guy, you know? But sometimes you have to do what you can to survive. Sometimes you do things you never thought you would, just to get by." Tommy's eyes softened as he listened. He had been so caught up in the moment, in the need to prove himself, that he hadn't considered the possibility that the biker's anger came from something deeper, something personal. The biker looked up, meeting Tommy's gaze for the first time. "I get it now," he muttered, almost as if admitting it to himself. "Maybe I don't need to prove anything to you, or anyone else." Tommy nodded slowly, understanding now that strength wasn't just about standing tall in the face of a challenge. It was about acknowledging the battles others were fighting too. For a brief moment, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The biker, now looking almost vulnerable, took a step back, as if weighing his words. The tension seemed to deflate, but something still lingered, something unspoken, an edge that had yet to be resolved. Tommy felt the change, but he also felt the quiet danger in the air. The biker wasn't finished. And then, as quickly as the vulnerability appeared, it vanished. The biker's eyes hardened again, the mask of arrogance slipping back into place. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders, trying to reassert his dominance. "You think you've won," the biker sneered, his posture stiffening with a sudden surge of aggression. "But you haven't. Not yet." Tommy's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure if this was just another one of the biker's tricks, or if he was genuinely done. But before he could even process the shift, the biker took a step forward, too quickly, too recklessly. He was trying to prove something again, this time to himself. In one fluid motion, the biker swung his fist at Tommy, an all-out attack born of frustration and pride. But Tommy was ready. As the fist came at him, he instinctively sidestepped, the biker's momentum carrying him forward with a misstep. Tommy didn't hesitate. He planted his foot, and with a quick, sharp push, the biker lost his balance. For a brief, horrifying second, the biker's foot slipped on the pavement. His body lurched forward, and before he could correct himself, he collided with a streetlight pole. The loud thud echoed through the quiet street. The biker crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain, his face contorted in surprise and disbelief. Tommy stood frozen for a moment, his breath shallow. He hadn't meant for it to happen this way. He had simply defended himself, hadn't expected the biker's dangerous misstep to end the way it did. The crowd that had gathered around watched in stunned silence. Tommy's heart raced, but it wasn't from triumph. It was from a realization that the fight had gone further than he had ever intended. The line between standing his ground and pushing too far had blurred, and now the consequences were clear. The biker lay on the ground, groaning and clutching his side, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. The streetlight above flickered, as if mirroring the unease in the air. Tommy stood a few feet away, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The moment of truth had arrived, and it was nothing like he had imagined. He hadn't meant to bring the fight to this point. He hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, especially not like this. His eyes moved over the biker's crumpled form, his chest rising and falling erratically, the anger that had once surged through him now replaced by a cold, uncomfortable clarity. Tommy didn't know what to do. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the line between mercy and consequence hanging in the balance. The biker had taunted him, had pushed him to the edge, but had he gone too far? Had he overstepped by using the biker's misstep against him? His pulse hammered in his ears as doubt crept in. For a long moment, all Tommy could hear was the sound of the biker's labored breathing. The crowd was quiet now, almost as if they, too, were waiting for something. It was a crossroads, and Tommy knew he had to make a choice. The biker had underestimated him, had tried to break him. But now, Tommy had the upper hand. The biker shifted slightly, groaning. "Get up, kid," he muttered, though his voice was strained, weaker than before. "You think you've won? You don't even know what you're dealing with." Tommy's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He wasn't going to let the biker bait him into more violence. Instead, he took a step back, his stance steady. He had already proven himself. He didn't need to prove anything else. The words came out softer than he had expected. "I don't want to fight anymore," Tommy said, his voice steady, though his chest still felt tight. "I'm done. This ends now." The biker stared at him, disbelief flickering in his eyes. The crowd, too, waited, unsure what would come next. But for Tommy, the moment had already been decided. He had shown his strength, but true power wasn't in the fight. It was in knowing when to walk away. As Tommy stood, the weight of his decision pressing down on him, Stallone remained still, watching the scene unfold with an expression that was both calm and unwavering. The moment hung in the air, But where others might have felt the tension or even panic, Stallone remained a quiet pillar of composure. His presence was a stark contrast to the chaos of the street, the bikers' groans, and the murmurings from the small crowd that had gathered. Tommy glanced over at him, feeling a surge of gratitude mixed with confusion. How could Stallone remain so calm, so unaffected by the heat of the situation? The biker was still on the ground, stunned and angry, but the fight had clearly left him, his energy spent in a mix of pain and humiliation. "You did good," Stallone finally said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of experience. Tommy looked at him, unsure of what to say. "You showed restraint when it mattered. That's the hardest thing to do." The simplicity of the words hit Tommy harder than any punch. It wasn't about winning, wasn't about knocking someone down, wasn't about proving yourself in the heat of the moment. It was about control, about knowing when to stop, when to walk away. The biker shifted again, his breathing labored, and for a second, Tommy thought he might make another move, but the challenge in his eyes had dimmed. He was no longer the force of intimidation. Instead, he was just a man, vulnerable and out of options. Tommy could feel the shift. He wasn't the only one who had grown in the last few minutes. Stallone stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, and placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "That's how you win a fight, kid," he said, his voice steady. "Not by throwing punches, but by knowing what you're really fighting for." Tommy nodded, the realization settling in. The power wasn't in winning, it was in keeping your peace. Stallone's calmness wasn't just a trait, it was a way of life, and in that quiet moment, Tommy understood it more than ever. He hadn't just won tonight. He had learned something far more valuable. The air was thick with tension as Tommy stood facing the biker, his crutch in his hand, the remnants of the streetlight casting shadows that seemed to stretch out forever. The crowd had grown silent, their eyes fixed on the scene before them. The biker, still sprawled on the ground, was now visibly seething with frustration. He'd been humiliated, knocked off balance by his own arrogance and by Tommy's unexpected calmness. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, something in the biker snapped. "Enough of this," the biker shouted, scrambling to his feet, his eyes wild. He was fueled now not just by pain, but by his bruised pride. He hadn't expected the fight to turn out this way. He hadn't expected Tommy to not just stand up to him, but to hold his ground, to make him question everything he thought he knew about strength. But the biker was no longer interested in reasoning. He was done with the games. Tommy tightened his grip on his crutch, but there was no panic in him, no fear, just a quiet, unshakable resolve. He had done this. He had stood tall, refused to back down. But he knew that the final challenge was coming. It would test him in ways that no words or taunts could. The biker lunged at him, his fists swinging in a desperate, angry arc. This time, Tommy didn't sidestep. Instead, he pivoted, using the crutch like an extension of himself. He blocked the biker's punch, deflecting it with a swift, controlled motion, and then, with a sudden burst of strength, he shoved the biker back. The force sent the man stumbling, his back hitting the sidewalk with a loud thud. The crowd gasped, the streetlights flickering in the stillness that followed. The biker lay there, winded and shaken, but for the first time, he didn't get up. His eyes met Tommy's, and the defiance had drained from them. There was nothing left, no fight, no arrogance. Just a man who had finally realized his limits. Tommy stood over him, breathing steadily, his heart still pounding, but his body calm. He had already won, not with his fists, but with his resolve. This was the final showdown, and it had never been about the fight. It had always been about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. The biker lay on the cold pavement, breathing heavily, his body still rattling from the impact. For a moment, all he could do was stare at the ground, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Tommy stood above him, crutch in hand, but there was no triumph in his stance, no swagger. Just quiet, undeniable strength. The biker's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a mix of confusion and frustration. He had come into this confrontation expecting a quick victory, a brutal reminder of his dominance. He had taunted, pushed, tried to break Tommy down, but now He was the one broken. His pride was in pieces, his body aching, and his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to answer. Tommy didn't speak immediately. He stood there, letting the silence hang between them. The crowd had already begun to disperse, the moment hanging in the air like a fragile thread, waiting to be cut. But it wasn't just the crowd that had changed. It was the biker, too. "Why didn't you just finish it?" the biker finally muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "You had the chance. You could have knocked me out. Done what I was expecting." Tommy's expression softened, his gaze steady but understanding. "Because I'm not you," he said quietly. "I don't need to win by breaking someone else down. That's not strength. That's weakness." The biker blinked, a flash of something uncertain passing through his eyes. He had expected more violence, more chaos, something loud, something that matched the anger he had felt for so long. But Tommy had shown him something different. He had shown him that true power wasn't in domination, but in restraint. In control. The biker looked up at him, his breath shaky, but his eyes clearer than they had been before. He was beginning to understand, or at least starting to question everything he had thought he knew about strength. It wasn't about being the loudest, the strongest, or the most aggressive. It was about knowing when to stop, when to stand your ground without crossing the line. For the first time, the biker looked away from Tommy, his gaze drifting down the street. And for the first time, he wasn't just a bully. He was a man, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The street was quiet now, the hum of traffic in the distance the only sound that filled the air. The crowd had dispersed, their murmurs fading into the background, leaving just Tommy and the biker standing there, the final moments of their confrontation hanging in the cool evening air. Tommy took a deep breath, his chest still tight from the intensity of the moment. His crutch felt heavier now, but it wasn't just the weight of the wood. It was the weight of what he had just experienced. He had faced the biker, stood his ground, and walked away without falling into the trap of violence. He hadn't just proved something to the man on the ground. He had proved something to himself. The biker was still sitting on the pavement, his back against a streetlight pole, his head hung low. He hadn't gotten up, hadn't said anything since Tommy had spoken. The anger, the bravado, the arrogance, all of it had drained from him. He looked small now, tired, and broken in ways that weren't just physical. Tommy took a step toward him, his movements slow, deliberate. "You all right?" he asked, his voice steady but not unkind. The biker's eyes flickered up to meet Tommy's. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on him. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice raspy. "I think so." Tommy nodded. He could see it now, the change, the realization in the biker's eyes. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't some grand gesture of reconciliation, but it was enough. The fight had ended, and both of them had walked away from it different people. "Good," Tommy said, his tone softer now. "You don't need to do this anymore. You don't need to keep pushing people down to feel strong." The biker didn't respond right away, but for the first time, Tommy saw something in him, a flicker of understanding. The biker had been defeated, not by force, but by the realization that his power had never been real. It had been built on fear and pride. But now, in the aftermath of their encounter, that foundation had crumbled, and maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to rebuild. The street was empty now, the noise of the confrontation fading into the distance. Tommy stood near the curb, his breath steadying as he finally allowed himself to take in the quiet aftermath. The streetlights above flickered gently, casting a soft glow on the pavement, where the marks of the altercation still lingered, scrapes, the discarded crutch, the tension that had once filled the air. The biker, now standing shakily, had managed to gather himself, though his steps were uncertain. His pride had been torn to pieces, but there was something else now, something deeper. Tommy could see the change in him. He was no longer the loud, brash man who had first crossed his path. He wasn't a threat anymore, not the way he had been. "What happens now?" the biker asked, his voice low, almost tentative. He glanced at Tommy, his eyes a mix of uncertainty and a strange, hesitant respect. Tommy took a deep breath, his eyes steady. "You don't get to walk away like you did before. Not this time." The biker looked down at his feet, shifting uneasily, as though unsure of what to expect next. There had been a time when he would have just shrugged it off, walked away, and continued with his life of intimidation. But Tommy's words lingered in the air like a warning, a promise that things couldn't go back to how they were. "You've already got the first step," Tommy continued, his voice calm. "You've recognized what you've been doing. You're not just some guy anymore. You can change." The biker looked up at him, confusion in his eyes, but also something else, something that hadn't been there before, the hint of accountability. It wasn't a grand revelation, but it was enough. A few moments passed in silence. Then, Tommy took a step back. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about change. It's about learning. You got the chance to do that now. The biker stood there, eyes fixed on Tommy, his gaze softened. In that moment, the fight wasn't over. It had never been about fists or dominance. Justice had been served, not through violence, but through understanding. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. The street was quieter now, the world moving on as it always did, but for Tommy and the biker, something had shifted. The crowd had long since dissipated, leaving only the two of them standing in the dim light. Tommy's heart was still pounding, but it wasn't from anger anymore. It was from something else, the quiet realization that what had just happened, what had just been set in motion, was far bigger than the fight itself. The biker, still lingering near the sidewalk, was quiet now. He wasn't standing tall or puffing out his chest. Instead, he was slumped slightly, a man who had been knocked down, not physically but emotionally. Tommy could see the weight in his posture, the realization that the power he had always clung to had never been real. Tommy's gaze softened, not out of sympathy, but understanding. "You've got to stop living like this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not who you think you are. You're more than this anger." The biker didn't respond at first. He just stood there, his eyes on the pavement, his fists clenched at his sides. But after a moment, he looked up, meeting Tommy's gaze with something that felt different. It wasn't defiance anymore. It was something softer, regret, maybe, or the first flicker of self-awareness. "I don't know where to start," the biker admitted, his voice raw with something Tommy hadn't expected, vulnerability. Tommy stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Start with looking at what you've done, and then ask yourself if you're proud of it. The rest comes after that." The biker swallowed hard, the words settling deep in his chest. He wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew Tommy was right. His power, the one he had once relied on, had come from brokenness, his own, and the pain he had caused others. Tommy didn't offer any more words. Instead, he just stood there, silent but present. The biker took a slow breath, the weight of his actions beginning to feel like something he could change. Slowly, he nodded, the first step of a long journey ahead of him. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew, for the first time, that rebuilding was possible. The night air had settled into a soft quiet, the street now empty except for the faint hum of distant traffic. Tommy stood on the sidewalk, his crutch leaning against him, his chest still heavy with the weight of everything that happened. The biker, now standing beside him, seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but in a way that went beyond the scars and bruises. There was something different in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Tommy didn't say anything for a while, letting the silence fill the space between them. The world was still turning, life going on as it always did, but in this small corner of the world, something had changed. The biker had walked away from the confrontation, but it wasn't just the fight that had ended. It was the beginning of something new, for both of them. "Guess I got some work to do," the biker said quietly, his voice rough. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Tommy, an uncertain but genuine honesty in his eyes. "I don't know what happens next, but I can't keep pretending like this is all there is." Tommy nodded, a soft smile pulling at the corner of his lips. "It's not about pretending. It's about being real, about knowing who you are and what you stand for." The biker nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Tommy could tell he wasn't fully sure what the next step would be, but there was no doubt that something inside him had clicked. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the street hours ago, and neither was Tommy. The biker took a deep breath, then extended his hand to Tommy. It wasn't the kind of handshake that came with a victory, but one that spoke of mutual understanding, Respect not earned through force, but through the willingness to grow. Tommy shook his hand firmly, feeling the strength of that connection. "Thanks, kid," the biker said, his voice quieter now. "You taught me something today." Tommy watched him turn and walk down the street, his footsteps no longer heavy with arrogance, but carrying the weight of a new beginning. And as Tommy stood there, watching the biker fade into the night, he felt something inside him shift, too. This wasn't just the end of one story. It was the beginning of something better, for both of them.